When leaving became a choice instead of an order, nothing changed. No rush, no escape, no fear. Only a man standing still while everyone else prepared to go, and a single question hanging in the air. Why does someone stay when nothing is stopping him from leaving? The moment when departure became a real possibility did not arrive as a sudden event, but as a slow administrative shift that moved quietly through the camp in the form of changed routines, altered schedules, new conversations among officers, and subtle changes in daily procedures that signaled transition without ever announcing it openly, allowing the physical structure of the camp to remain the same while the psychological meaning of that structure began to change. The fences still stood, the barracks remained in place, the work details continued, and the daily rhythm of meals, roll calls, and assignments followed the same pattern. Yet the purpose of these routines started to feel different as the idea of leaving entered the daily awareness of the prisoners. For many men, this change immediately reshaped behavior. As conversations shifted toward paperwork, transport, destinations, and return routes, and attention moved from present routine to future planning, with groups forming around discussions of home, families, and the lives waiting beyond the camp, creating a visible psychological movement toward departure that could be observed in daily interactions, work details, and social spaces. The camp began to feel like a temporary place again for those men, no longer a fixed world, but a waiting space they were preparing to leave behind. For him, the change did not produce the same response. His routines remained unchanged. His behavior followed the same patterns, and his daily movements through the camp showed no visible shift toward preparation or anticipation, as he continued to report to work details, follow schedules, and participate in daily tasks without altering his rhythm or attention. While others began organizing their days around what came next, he continued organizing his days around what already existed, moving through the same spaces, following the same paths, and engaging with the same routines as if the structure of life had not changed at all. This difference did not come from confusion or lack of information, because the changes were visible and widely understood, and it did not come from resistance or defiance, because there was no outward opposition or refusal in his behavior, but from a quiet detachment from the idea of movement itself, where the concept of leaving did not attach itself to his daily thinking or his sense of direction. The camp remained the center of his daily life, not as a place of confinement, but as a functioning environment that provided structure, rhythm, and predictability, with clearly defined roles, familiar routines, and known expectations that shaped every aspect of daily existence. The outside world, by contrast, remained distant and abstract, spoken about by others, but not integrated into his daily perception, existing more as an idea than as a destination. Where others began to change their behavior by preparing, planning, and adjusting their routines around the future, he continued to live entirely within the present structure of the camp, measuring time by tasks rather than dates, by routines rather than plans, and by repetition rather than progress. His attention stayed focused on the immediate world around him, on the physical environment of the camp, on the daily sequence of work and rest, and on the predictable order that shaped each day. The difference became visible in small details, in the way he remained absent from planning conversations, in the way he did not participate in discussions about transport or destinations, in the way he did not alter his daily habits in response to the changing atmosphere around him. He did not withdraw from others, and he did not isolate himself, but he also did not engage with the future-oriented energy that began to move through the camp. For him, the camp did not feel like a place he was waiting to leave, but a place where life was continuing in a stable and understandable way, while the idea of departure remained distant, undefined, and disconnected from his daily experience. The structure of the camp still organized his life, still gave shape to his days, and still provided a framework in which he understood his role, his routine, and his place in the world. As the atmosphere of transition grew stronger around him, his internal orientation remained fixed on the present environment rather than on the future beyond the fences, creating a quiet contrast between those who were preparing to go and the one man who continued to live as if nothing was pulling him forward. This was not a conscious decision and not a declared position, but a behavioral pattern that revealed itself through consistency rather than choice, through routine rather than resistance, and through continuity rather than change. The possibility of leaving existed all around him, but it did not shape his actions, his attention, or his daily life, because his sense of direction remained anchored in the structure he already knew rather than in a future he did not yet recognize as his own, creating the first clear separation between physical freedom and psychological movement. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the atmosphere of transition continued to grow inside the camp, the contrast between those who were preparing to leave and the man who remained unchanged became more visible in daily life, not through confrontation or open conflict, but through small behavioral differences that revealed a deeper psychological separation between movement and stillness. While others adjusted their routines, reorganized their priorities, and began structuring their days around future plans, paperwork, and conversations about destinations, he continued to structure his days around the same tasks, the same schedules, and the same repetitive patterns that had always defined life inside the camp. The future began to shape the behavior of many prisoners in visible ways, as their attention shifted away from the present environment and toward what lay beyond the fences, creating a growing sense of anticipation that could be felt in conversations, work details, and social interactions. The camp, for them, slowly lost its sense of permanence and became a temporary space they were mentally preparing to leave behind, a place that no longer held psychological weight beyond its function as a waiting point. For him, the camp did not lose its meaning in the same way. His daily behavior remained centered on the present structure of life inside the camp, where time was still measured by routines rather than plans, by repetition rather than transition, and by tasks rather than destinations. The outside world, which began to occupy the thoughts and conversations of others, remained distant and abstract in his internal perception, existing as an idea rather than a lived reality that shaped his daily awareness. This difference did not come from ignorance or isolation, because he was fully aware of the changes taking place around him. And it did not come from resistance or fear, because there was no sign of anxiety or opposition in his behavior, but from a deeper detachment from the idea of movement itself, where leaving did not function as a meaningful direction in his internal world. Where others began to emotionally detach from the camp and psychologically attach themselves to the future, he continued to attach himself to the present environment, to the physical spaces of the camp, to the routines that organized his days, and to the predictable order that gave structure to daily life. The fences, the barracks, the work areas, and the common spaces remained the center of his lived experience, while the world beyond them remained a distant abstraction. This internal orientation shaped his attention, his habits, and his behavior in subtle but consistent ways, as he remained absent from future-oriented conversations, disengaged from planning activities, and unchanged in his daily routines, not because he rejected what others were doing, but because their direction did not align with his internal sense of stability and meaning. The future, which began to feel real and tangible for many prisoners, remained psychologically undefined for him. lacking the emotional clarity and personal connection needed to shape his behavior or his sense of direction. Freedom, in this form, did not appear as opportunity, but as an undefined space without structure, rhythm, or familiarity, making it difficult for his mind to attach desire or intention to the idea of departure. Inside the camp, everything remained coherent, organized, and predictable, providing a stable internal framework in which daily life made sense and identity remained anchored to routine rather than aspiration. Outside the camp, nothing felt coherent, organized, or familiar, creating a psychological imbalance in which the known world carried more weight than the unknown future. This imbalance did not produce tension or conflict, but quiet detachment, as his internal world remained centered on what already existed rather than on what was supposed to come next. The camp continued to function as the primary reference point for meaning, structure, and daily existence, while the future remained a distant concept without emotional authority. As more men began to shift their attention outward, his attention remained inward and present-focused, creating a growing psychological separation between those who were moving toward departure and the one man who remained anchored in the structure he already knew. This separation was not marked by a single moment or a visible decision, but by consistency, repetition, and continuity of behavior that revealed a deeper internal orientation toward stability rather than movement. The possibility of leaving existed everywhere around him, but it did not shape his daily life, his habits, or his sense of direction, because his internal world remained organized around the present environment rather than around a future he had not yet recognized as his own. As the weeks passed and the process of transition continued around him, the psychological distance between physical freedom and internal direction became more pronounced, not through open conflict or visible refusal, but through a growing separation between how the camp changed for others and how it remained the same for him. For many prisoners, the camp was already losing its meaning as a living space and becoming only a temporary holding point in their minds, a place they were mentally leaving before they physically departed, while for him it continued to function as the center of daily life, organizing time, behavior, and identity through structure rather than expectation. The environment itself did not change, but perception did, and perception reshaped experience because meaning was no longer shared in the same way. Where others began to see the fences as temporary barriers and the barracks as spaces they would soon abandon, he continued to experience them as fixed elements of daily existence, not as symbols of confinement, but as familiar reference points that defined the world he moved through each day. The physical space of the camp still structured his attention, his habits, and his sense of order, while the world beyond the fences remained distant, abstract, and psychologically unreal. This difference in perception created a quiet separation that was not based on disagreement, but on orientation, as his inner world remained anchored in the present while the inner worlds of others increasingly shifted toward the future. Conversations around him became filled with anticipation, speculation, and planning. Yet those words did not reshape his internal focus, because the future they described did not connect to the identity he had formed within the structure of the camp. Their excitement, anxiety, and expectation existed around him, but not within him. His daily life continued to be shaped by routine rather than preparation, by repetition rather than planning, and by structure rather than projection, allowing the present to remain psychologically complete in itself. He continued to move through the same paths, perform the same tasks, and follow the same rhythms without altering his behavior in response to the changing atmosphere. Not because he was unaware of what was happening, but because his internal sense of meaning was no longer tied to the idea of movement. The concept of departure existed as information, but not as motivation, because motivation requires emotional attachment, identity continuity, and a sense of personal direction, none of which were activated by the idea of leaving. The future remained undefined, lacking shape, familiarity, and psychological coherence, while the present remained structured, predictable, and emotionally intelligible, creating a mental environment in which stability carried more weight than possibility. Inside the camp, life continued to make sense on a daily level because it offered order, rhythm, and continuity, while the outside world remained conceptually distant and internally unformed, existing only as a vague idea rather than as a lived reality. This imbalance shaped his internal orientation, making the known environment feel more real than the unknown future and making continuity feel more coherent than change. The past also began to lose its authority as a guide for direction, because the person he had been before captivity no longer felt continuous with the person he had become inside the camp, creating a psychological gap between memory and identity. Home existed as an image, but not as a destination that shaped his present thinking or behavior, because it no longer aligned with the structure of his internal world. Without forming a conscious decision, without articulating a position, and without experiencing internal conflict, his mind continued to settle into a state where the present was sufficient and the future was unnecessary, where routine replaced aspiration and familiarity replaced desire. The camp did not become a place of belonging, but remained a place of psychological coherence, while the outside world remained a space of psychological uncertainty. In this quiet transformation, the idea of leaving did not disappear, but it lost its influence, its urgency, and its power to shape behavior, allowing daily life to continue within a contained psychological structure where movement was no longer a defining force and change was no longer a necessary condition for meaning. As this quiet internal separation deepened, the contrast between the stable inner world he inhabited and the changing psychological atmosphere around him became more clearly defined, not through visible opposition or spoken refusal, but through the continued consistency of his behavior and the unchanging structure of his daily life. While the camp gradually transformed in meaning for others, shifting from a living environment into a temporary waiting space in their minds, it continued to function for him as a complete and coherent world, organizing his time, his actions, and his sense of order through routine rather than anticipation. For many prisoners, the present had begun to lose its importance as attention moved toward the future. But for him, the present remained the primary psychological reference point, shaping perception, identity, and meaning through repetition and familiarity. The daily rhythm of work details, meals, roll calls, and rest periods continued to define his sense of time, not as a countdown toward departure, but as a stable cycle that gave structure to existence. The camp's physical spaces remained central to his lived experience, while the outside world remained distant, undefined, and emotionally abstract. The idea of leaving still existed as a known fact, but it no longer carried psychological authority over his thinking or behavior, because authority requires emotional investment and internal direction, neither of which were activated by the prospect of departure. Instead of orienting himself toward change, he oriented himself more deeply toward continuity, allowing the familiar structure of daily life to remain the organizing principle of his inner world. Where others began to mentally detach from the camp and emotionally attach themselves to what came next, he continued to attach himself to the present environment, to the routines that organized his days, and to the predictable order that shaped each moment. The fences, the barracks, and the work areas remained reference points of stability rather than symbols of confinement, because they were integrated into his daily perception as elements of a world that still made sense. This internal orientation created a psychological stillness that did not resemble resignation or surrender, but adaptation, as the mind aligned itself with what was stable rather than what was uncertain. The future, lacking structure and familiarity, remained psychologically distant, while the present, defined by order and repetition, remained emotionally intelligible. His behavior reflected this orientation in subtle but consistent ways, as he continued to move through the camp without altering his routines, without engaging in preparation, and without participating in future-oriented planning, not because he rejected the idea of departure, but because it did not resonate with his internal sense of meaning. The anticipation that filled the camp around him passed through his environment without entering his inner world. Over time, this internal alignment with stability rather than movement reshaped his sense of direction, making change feel unnecessary rather than threatening, and making continuity feel sufficient rather than limiting. The concept of return remained present as information, but not as a personal objective that shaped his identity or his daily existence. The camp did not become home in an emotional sense, and the outside world did not become an enemy in a psychological sense, because neither concept dominated his internal life. Instead, his inner world remained balanced within a contained structure where routine replaced aspiration, repetition replaced progression, and familiarity replaced desire. Without any formal decision, without any declared intention, and without any visible turning point, a condition formed in which staying was no longer experienced as an act, and leaving was no longer experienced as a goal. Daily life continued within a stable psychological framework that no longer required movement to create meaning or change to create purpose. In this state, the present became enough, not because it was ideal, but because it was coherent, predictable, and internally stable, while the future remained undefined, distant, and psychologically unformed. The separation between physical freedom and psychological direction continued to widen, creating a quiet internal reality in which the mind remained anchored to what was known rather than drawn toward what was possible. As this psychological equilibrium became more deeply established, daily life inside the camp continued to unfold with the same external stability, the same predictable routines, and the same structured rhythm that had defined existence for years, creating a continuity that no longer felt transitional, but instead felt self-contained, not because it offered fulfillment, but because it offered coherence, familiarity, and internal order. The present was no longer experienced as a temporary stage before something else, and the future was no longer experienced as a destination that shaped behavior, because the internal structure of meaning had reorganized itself around stability rather than movement and around continuity rather than change. The idea of departure still existed as a known reality, but it no longer carried emotional authority, no longer shaped intention, and no longer influenced identity, because the internal world had already detached from the concept of transition as a necessary condition for meaning. The outside world remained distant and abstract, not rejected, not feared, and not opposed, but psychologically disconnected from his sense of self, because the life beyond the camp no longer aligned with the identity that had formed within its structure. Inside the camp, existence remained psychologically coherent, defined by familiar spaces, known limits, and predictable routines that required no reconstruction of self and no reinvention of identity. allowing daily life to exist without internal tension between what was and what could be. Meaning emerged from repetition rather than aspiration, from stability rather than possibility, and from continuity rather than transformation, creating a contained psychological space in which the present felt sufficient. Other prisoners continued to orient themselves toward departure, preparing mentally for reintegration, return, and movement into a world that had changed while they remained confined, while he remained internally detached from this orientation, not in opposition to it, but outside of it, because their future no longer intersected with his psychological reality. Their anticipation did not create resonance, and their preparation did not create motivation, because his internal world no longer operated within a framework of progression or transition. The past no longer functioned as a foundation for direction, and the future no longer functioned as a source of identity, leaving his psychological existence centered entirely in the present structure of daily life. Where time passed through repetition, identity remained anchored in routine, and meaning was produced by structure rather than self-determination. In this state, movement lost urgency and change lost significance, not through fear, but through long-term adaptation to containment and predictability. Remaining did not feel like a decision, and staying did not feel like a choice, because both concepts require internal conflict and psychological tension, neither of which existed within his internal structure. The absence of movement did not feel like stagnation, and the absence of change did not feel like loss, because psychological balance had already been achieved within the present structure of existence. The camp did not become a place of belonging, and the outside world did not become a place of rejection, because neither held emotional dominance over his internal life. Instead, his inner world remained balanced within a contained psychological space where routine replaced aspiration, familiarity replaced desire, and continuity replaced transformation. In this condition, the meaning of freedom dissolved not through defiance, but through irrelevance, and the meaning of return faded not through resistance, but through disconnection, leaving only the present structure of life, the familiar rhythm of daily existence, and the internal stillness of a mind that no longer oriented itself toward departure as a defining force of identity or meaning. In the end, nothing dramatic marked the boundary between captivity and freedom, because the transformation had already taken place quietly within the structure of daily life, long before any physical departure could occur, as the mind had reorganized itself around stability rather than movement and continuity rather than change. What remained was not a refusal of home and not a rejection of freedom, but a psychological state in which meaning no longer came from the future and identity no longer depended on transition, because daily existence had become internally coherent within a structure that required no reinvention of self and no reconstruction of purpose. The camp did not become a place of belonging, and the outside world did not become a place of fear, because neither held emotional dominance over his inner life, as both had become abstract concepts disconnected from the structure that now defined meaning, identity, and balance. Freedom lost its pull not through resistance or defiance, but through irrelevance, because it no longer aligned with the internal organization of his psychological world. What remained was a quiet internal equilibrium, where continuity replaced aspiration, familiarity replaced possibility, and presence replaced projection, allowing life to continue without tension between what was and what could be. In this state, movement was no longer necessary for meaning, and the future was no longer required for identity, because psychological balance had already formed within the present structure of existence. This was not the story of a man who chose captivity over freedom, but the story of how the human mind adapts to structure, routine, and containment until stability becomes stronger than possibility, and the present becomes more powerful than any imagined return. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.